Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Dear friends, in your MA program, the another critic that we want to discuss today is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Welcome all of you in the Chaitanya studio of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Myself, Professor Dilip Barad, Head of the Department of English from Maharaja Krishna Kumar Singh Ji, BAOUGujarat University, Gujarat. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who lived between 1772 and 1834, is very famously considered as the Romantic poet, the pioneers of the Romantic movement in English literature. But here we are not going to study Coleridge as a poet, but we are going to see him as a critic. His critical treatise is written as or published as Biographia Literaria, and it has several chapters in that. Today we are going to concentrate on a few ideas as a critic, as a poet critic, that Samuel Taylor Coleridge has shared in chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria. And this chapter is very important, or the views given in this chapter are very important from couple of point of views. It also strikes at some of the debates which are perhaps never ending debates. And here he strikes at not only about the language of poetry or the difference between poetry and prose, but also between a poem and poetry. So that is something very interesting to see, that what difference between poem and poetry Samuel Taylor Coleridge is discussing in this chapter. Let us have a look at it. A written monument of Coleridge's critical work is contained in 24 chapters of Biographia Literaria, as just we discussed. That was written between 1815 and 17, over 2 years of time. In his critical disquisition, Coleridge concerns himself not only with the practice of criticism, but also with its theory. In his practical approach to criticism, we get the glimpse of Coleridge, the poet, whereas in theoretical discussion, Coleridge, the philosopher, come to the center stage. And chapter 14 is a unique combination of both the things. Coleridge as a poet, Coleridge as a philosopher is reflected when he is pondering upon the critical theory and the poetic process as such. In chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge's view on nature and function of poetry is discussed in philosophical terms. The poet within Coleridge discusses the difference between poetry and prose and the immediate function of poetry, whereas the philosopher discusses the difference between poetry and poem. He was the first English writer to insist that every work of art is, by its very nature, an organic whole. At the first step, he rules out the assumption which from Horace onwards had wrought such havoc in criticism, that the object of poetry is to instruct, or as a less extreme form of the heresy had asserted, to make man morally better. Well, we can put Coleridge into those group of writers who believe in art for the sake of art. So he won't deal with the idea that, well, poetry should make man morally better or that. So he is there to remove the cloud around that aspect of literature, the moral philosophical aspect of literature there. Quite amazing, quite interesting to know this, because He's a friend, Wordsworth. Both of them wrote lyrical ballads together in 1798, and that was the official beginning of the Romantic era. And Wordsworth, we know, is in a way a champion of seeing divinity, teacher, moral codes in nature. And whereas Coleridge is there to remove those assumptions that poetry should make man morally better. Key issues in chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria. We will also mention some questions here so that in case you prepare for the exam, then also you can get some help from which questions are discussed in the subsequent part of the video. So we'll deal with the initial part of this chapter 14, wherein we'll get the discussion on two cardinal points of poetry. And this quote also: during the first year that Mr. Wordsworth and I were neighbors, our conversations turned frequently on the two cardinal points of poetry. So we need to explain with reference that in which context Coleridge is speaking about two cardinal points and what are these cardinal points. So two cardinal points of poetry which Coleridge discusses in the initial part of the essay, chapter number 14 of Biographia Literaria are, he begins the chapter with the view on cardinal points of poetry. To him, these cardinal points are, first, the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. I repeat again, the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by faithful adherence to the truth of nature. And the second cardinal point was the power of giving the interest of novelty by modifying the colors of imagination. According to him, it was decided that Wordsworth would write poetry dealing with the theme of first cardinal point, and the other was to be dealt by him. So Wordsworth would write about power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by faithfully adhering to the truth of the nature. And we know that Wordsworthian most of the poems are about the nature, and truthfully he adheres to the nature the way it is visible. Whereas Coleridge's poems like Kubla Khan or the Rime of Ancient Mariner, what we find is that he gives power of the interest of novelty, or he mystifies the reality or the truth or the nature. Novelty by modifying with the colors of imagination. So his works are to some extent even fantastic also, going beyond the imagination also. In chapter number 4, he talked about the difference between fancy and imagination also. So that is how they decided to write the poems in lyrical ballads, and this point makes it very clear that what was the difference between the poems written by Wordsworth and Coleridge. For the first type of poetry, the treatment and subject matter should be, to quote Coleridge, I quote, the sudden charm which accidents of light and shade, which moon and light and sunset diffused over a known and familiar landscape, appeared to represent the practicability of combining both. These are the poetry of nature. In such poems, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village, in its vicinity, where there is a meditative and feeling mind to seek after them or to notice them when they present themselves. So that is the secret of the simplicity of Wordsworthian poetry. Or as in the preface of lyrical ballads, Wordsworth writes about man speaking to man, about common men, in the language of laymen. So that is what Coleridge affirms here, that was how it was decided that he will deal with the subjects of ordinary life. Characters and incidents will be from every village, from the vicinity that one finds. the meditative and the feeling mind, which is normally found in those spaces, will become the subject matter of that first type of poetry. In the second type of poetry, the incidents and agents were to be supernatural. So, Kubla Khan, Rhyme of Ancient Mariner, Albatross, the mysterious bird, water, water everywhere, and not a single drop to drink. So, those poems deal with that supernatural. In this sort of poetry, to quote Coleridge, and I quote, the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interest of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. And real in this sense they have been to every human being who from whatever source of delusion has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. A bird who every day comes on the mast of the ship is accidentally killed by one of the sailors, and suddenly there is a change in an environment. And everybody will connect that that killing of the bird was a mistake and it was an ill omen, and because of that, the nature has suddenly changed the colors. Now, who will be the human being who won't believe in this thing? Whereas almost everybody has such kind of mystical beliefs into the nitty-gritties of life which are not easily understood by us. And so we tend to put all those things which we cannot understand, we can question but cannot find answers, into mysticism. And that was what Coleridge thought, that the second cardinal point of the poetry was to deal with this supernatural. Thus, with the help of imagination, the natural will be dealt supernaturally, and the poet and the reader will comprehend it with willing suspension of disbelief. So poets will willingly suspend their belief system and will fly with the poet into the poet's fancy, or primary imagination or secondary imagination. He will fly by willingly suspending their belief. So that was the two cardinal points about which he said in the initial part of the essay. The lyrical ballads consist of poems dealing with these two cardinal points, wherein the endeavor of Coleridge was to deal with persons and characters supernatural, and that of Wordsworth, I quote, was to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. So that is very clearly being mentioned in this chapter number 14, that what was the nature of their poems in lyrical ballads. Why were they so different? That was perhaps the plan of writing the lyrical ballads in such a fashion. Coming to the next aspect dealt in this chapter number 14 is about what are Coleridge's views towards Wordsworth's poetic creed. And I quote from chapter number 14, had Mr. Wordsworth's poems been the silly, the childish things, they must have sunk at once a dead weight into the slough of oblivion and have dragged the preface along with them. Now, if you have to explain this, then these are the lines which we come across in this chapter. So what is the context that he has to write such a thing about, or how he recalls Wordsworth of around after 20 years of lyrical ballads, 1798 to these works are written between 1815 and 1817, so around 18-20 years after lyrical ballads. How is Coleridge remembering Wordsworth? So Coleridge, even though he did not agree with Wordsworth's poetic or views on poetic diction or poetic creed, defended his poetic creed in chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria. Coleridge writes in defense to the violent assailant to the language of real life adopted by Wordsworth in the lyrical ballads. There had been strong criticism against Wordsworth's views expressed in preface also. And that is why, after 1798, in the second edition in 1800, he again wrote something more in preface in defense of what is poetry, who is a poet, what is poetic diction, what is the nature of poetry. Again in 1802, after 2 years, in the next edition of Lyrical Ballads, again he added a few more things because there was violent assailant against his poetic creed. Many people very openly said that, well, these are not poems, these are nursery rhymes. This simplicity with which these poems of Wordsworth are written, they are child's play, they are for children, they cannot be considered as poetry. There is a difference between nursery rhymes and poems. So he was attacked a lot, and maybe those attacks were still fresh even after 18-20 years, that Coleridge recalls and puts a defense for that. His defense is very interesting. Coleridge writes in his defense, I quote, "Had Mr. Wordsworth's poems been the silly, the childish things, as the critics were attacking against that, which they were of a long time described as being, had they been really distinguished from the compositions of other poets merely by meanness of language and inanity of thought, had they indeed contained nothing more than what is found in the parodies and pretended imitations of them, they must have sunk at once a dead weight into the slough of oblivion and have dragged the preface along with them." But we know that eddy of criticism which whirled around these poems and preface had perhaps gone into oblivion, had been lost now. What has survived after this hundreds of years is Wordsworth's preface, is Lyrical Ballads. And the historians, one after another of English literature, has remarked that this is the beginning of the new chapter in the history of English literature, the Romanticism, the Romantic era as such there. So Coleridge's defense after 20 years had an interesting worth, which also says that Coleridge as a critic also had that historical sense to understand that even though the contemporary critics do not agree with Wordsworth or they make fun of Wordsworth's poetry, they mimic the Wordsworth's poems, there was something so significant that more and more number of people were attracted towards Wordsworth. And what we have today, that Wordsworth is remembered today also as one of the greatest poets ever found in any of the languages, which proves the worth of Coleridge as a critic also. He writes there, but it has not happened so. Instead, to quote Coleridge, I quote, year after year increased the number of Mr. Wordsworth's admirers. They were found too not in the lower classes of the reading public, but chiefly among young men of strong ability and meditative minds. And their admiration, inflamed perhaps in some degree by opposition also, was distinguished by its intensity, I might almost say by its religious fervor. So if there were people who were anti-Wordsworth and making fun of that, there were people who were having a kind of a fan following and like a religious fervor, they wanted to write like Wordsworth also. Thus, Coleridge gives full credit to the genius of Wordsworth. That is also mentioned in chapter number 14 here. It does not mean that he agreed with Wordsworth on all the points. So that not to say that he was hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, walking with Wordsworth. Coleridge writes, and I quote, "With many parts of his preface, in the sense attributed to them and which the words undoubtedly seem to authorize, I never concurred, but on the contrary, objected to them as erroneous in principle and as contradictory in appearance at least, both to other parts of the same preface and to the author's own practice, in the greater number of the poems themselves. Well, this is again very interesting to observe and quite true also. Coleridge, who appreciated Wordsworth, who also found some problems with Wordsworth, and his problems are also quite genuine. We know that Wordsworth was self-contradictory in the preface. He said something here, something else in the another part of the preface. He said that this is how the poetry is to be written, and some of his poems did not follow what he said in the preface also. For example, when he said that poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, at the same time he also said that it is emotions recollected in tranquility. So spontaneous and tranquility are quite opposite to each other. So either there can be spontaneity or there can be tranquility. But it is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, then emotions recollected in tranquility. He said poet is a common man, a man among the men, but then again he says he is a very rare genius also. He do not have common sensibility. So it means that he is not a common man. He is not a man speaking to men, but he is gifted with some special geniusness. Now, that special geniusness is not normally gifted to laymen, to everybody. So there also there is contradiction that we find there. He said that a poet should write in the language of the common man, but then there should be selection of the language. So either you can have the language of the layman or you can have selection. But he said both the things there. So at various places we find very interesting contradiction in Wordsworth, which was identified by Coleridge. And so he said this, that some of his principles were erroneous. His famous poem Daffodils stands for his poetic creed, where he says that I wandered lonely as a cloud, and then when he has beautiful daffodils there, his heart lifts up like a rainbow in the sky, and in a euphoria he creates that. But then he says that in the last paragraph, and then I came back to home, lied in my couch, recalled everything, recollected all those visions, and then the poetry is created. So poetry is not created in the gust of spontaneity. Poetry is created when everything is relieved, when lying on the couch in the mood of tranquility, revisited those moods, those visions, and then the poet is writing the poem. Many of his poems were quite difficult also. It was not so simple poems. So some of the poems were very complex for the layman to understand also. So those were some of the observations of Coleridge on Wordsworth, where he objected to him also. Mr. Wordsworth in his recent collection has, I find, degraded his prefatory distinction to the end of his second volume to be read or not at the reader's choice also. Hence, we may say that Coleridge is frank enough to point out that some of the views of Wordsworth were wrong in principle and contradictory, and not only in parts of the preface but also to the practice of the poet himself in many of his poems also. So that is a very interesting part of chapter number 14 in Biographia Literaria, which Coleridge is referring there. Coming to another part of this chapter, and there we find a distinguish this between prose and poem, the difference between the prose and the poem. And we may have such kind of questions which the students might have to address these questions when they write an answer, and all these questions may find an answer into subsequent discussion in this part of the video. So how does Coleridge distinguish between prose and poem, or does the super addition of meter make the difference between prose and poem, or would then the mere super addition of meter with or without rhyme entitle these to the name of poems? A poem contains the same element as a prose composition. Elucidate what, according to Coleridge, is the nature and function of poem. So all this kind of questions can be asked, and in this part of the video we will find the answers for that. The poem contains the same elements as a prose composition, but the difference is between the combination of those elements and objects aimed at in both the composition. According to the difference of the object, which is aimed at in either prose composition or poetic composition, he says that the object will be the difference of the combination. If the object of the poet may simply be to facilitate the memory to recollect, that is to remember certain facts, he would make use of certain artificial arrangement of words with the help of meter. As a result, composition will be a poem because it is metrical composition merely because it is distinguished from composition in prose by meter or by rhyme. In this, the lowest sense, one might attribute the name of a poem to the well-known enumeration of the days in several months also. So, he gives an example that can we call this a prose or a poem? 30 days had September, April, June and November. So, if there is a rhyming line, September and November, can this be a prose? Or it is just giving an information, so it is just a prose. It just says that September had 30 days, so April, June and November also has 30 days. So is that not the function of the prose to give the information? Is that not the function or objective of the prose to give the information? Thus to Coleridge, mere super addition of meter or rhyme does not make a poem. So if I write in rhyming lines, I cannot say that this is a poem. And if I write in paragraphs, it doesn't mean that that is a prose. So that is one very interesting difference that Coleridge discusses here. The super addition of meter or anything just written in rhyming lines cannot be considered as poetry. We know that Alexander Pope wrote everything in rhyming lines, in heroic couplets. Even Dryden wrote lots of prosaic writing in poetry. Essays are written in poetic form by Alexander Pope. When we read essay by Matthew Arnold, a study of poetry, and when he is comparing various poets from Chaucer down the line to the Romantic poets also, wherein he brings Alexander Pope and Dryden also. But he very clearly says that I do not consider either Alexander Pope or Dryden as the great masters of poetry. I consider them as great masters of prose, who wrote prose in rhyming lines. So that is where this point gets important, that what is the difference between prose and poetry? Anything written in rhyming lines may be prose but not necessarily a poem. He further elucidates his viewpoint by various prose writings and its immediate purpose and ultimate end. So this is very important. Immediate purpose of writing and ultimate end, that perhaps may decide whether this is a prose or it is a poem, not the stylistic concerns of writing. In scientific and historical composition, which are prosaic, the immediate purpose is to convey the truth, that is facts. In the prose works of other kinds, for example, romances and novels, to give pleasure is the immediate purpose, and the ultimate end may be to give truth. Thus, the communication of pleasure may be the immediate object of a work not metrically composed also. So, when we see poem or poet in a larger context of literature, he speaks about two types of prose here. One prose that is literary prose, the another prose that is scientific or historical, where the immediate purpose and ultimate end differs. So, for the scientific language or historical language, the immediate purpose is to convey the truth, but for the romances and the novels, the ultimate end is to convey the truth. The immediate purpose is to entertain, to tell story, to please the reader. Now the question is, would then the mere superaddition of meter with or without rhyme entitle this to the name of poems? To this Coleridge replies that if meter is superadded, the other parts of the composition also must harmonize with it. In order to deserve the name poem, each part of the composition, including meter, rhyme, diction, and theme, must harmonize with the wholeness of the composition. Then that meter is a part of a poem. If it is only an additional ornament, and without the ornament also, if things look beautiful, then the ornament is super addition. Meter should not be added to provide merely a superficial decorative charm. Nothing can permanently please which does not contain in itself the reason why it is so, and not otherwise. If meter is superadded, all other parts must be made constant with it. They all must harmonize with one another. So for him, if meter has to be a part of poem, then it should be a part of harmonious whole. Otherwise, a superadded thing will not be defining factor in considering one thing as a poem. Thus, he comes to the definition of a poem. Thus, by discussing and differentiating it between prose writing and poem writing, within the prose also there are differences between scientific writing, historical writing, and romance and novels. And then he comes down to talk about, or he gives us the definition of a poem. I quote, a poem, therefore, may be defined as that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth, and from all other species having this object in common with it, that is romances and novels, he is trying to recall here, it is discriminated by proposing to itself such delight from the whole, the harmonious whole he meant to say, as is compatible with a distinct gratification from each component part. So the object, immediate object and ultimate object he differentiated. And so from the various other prose whose immediate object also is to please, like poetry, but still this poem is different from there, because here the each and every part of the thing has a harmonious whole and they all serve a specific purpose there, including the rhyme and the meter in its composition also. Thus, according to Coleridge, the poem is distinguished from prose composition by its immediate object. The immediate object of prose is to give truth, and that of poem is to please. He again distinguishes those prose compositions like romances and novels from poem whose object is similar to poem, that is to say, please also. So that is how the difference between poem and prose is discussed in this chapter. And also the prose has a dual function. The prose of scientific writing and historical writing is different from that of the prose of romance and novels. The objective of that prose is also to please, and that of the language of poetry also is to be pleased. So he also differentiates between that prose that is to please and the language of the poem which also is to please, but yet there is a different kind of harmonious organization in this particular composition. He calls this poem a legitimate poem and defines it as it must be one the parts of which mutually support and explain each other, all in their proportion, harmonizing with and supporting the purpose and non-influences of metrical arrangement. So what is this legitimate poem? It must be one the parts of which mutually support each other, each and everything, figures of speech, metaphors, language, rhyme, meter, they all support, they harmonize with each other, and they have its own influence on the metrical arrangement also. Therefore, the legitimate poem is a composition in which the rhyme and the meter bear an organic relation to the total work. While reading this sort of poem, the reader should be carried forward not merely or chiefly by the mechanical impulse of curiosity or by a restless desire to arrive at the final solution, but by the pleasurable activity of mind excited by the attractions of the journey itself. Now, this is very interesting. See, reading poetry is not to reach anywhere. Reading poetry is not to complete the reading of a poem. Reading poetry is a journey. There is nothing at the end of the poem. If there is the beauty or if there is something tangible in poetry to be enjoyed by the reader, it is in the process of journey. It is in the reading of the poem. Maybe when we read a story, we want to quickly reach at the end of the story to see the fate of the characters with whom we have started associating ourselves. But in poetry, perhaps according to Coleridge, there is no reaching anywhere. There is no destination which is so charmful in poetry. But the journey has its own charm in the poetry. That is where the meaning of legitimate poem lies. As we know that poetries are also not only to be read but to be recited. And poetry are to be listened also. Not only from the mouth of poet, but when a reader recites the poem, it is the listening of the poem where the beauty lies. And so that is that journey, and all the composition of the metrical and rhyming lines gives a beauty to the listening experience of the reader. And that is where a legitimate poem is completed in its essence. Here Coleridge asserts the importance of the impression created by the harmonious whole of the poem. To him, not one or other part, but the entire effect, the journey of reading poem should be pleasurable. Thus, Coleridge puts an end to the age-old controversy whether the end of the poem is instruction or delight. Its aim is definitely to give pleasure, and further poem has its own distinctive pleasure. Pleasure arising from the parts, and this pleasure of the parts supports and increases the pleasure of the whole also. So he brings to rest several conflicting voices. Obviously, pleasure is very important, but again, there is nothing like the ultimate end of the poem as such. It is a journey through which what we get it. It is not that the ultimate end of something is when one ends something, that one receives the aim or objective of that. We just begin a poem and the very first couplet perhaps gives us something that was the end of entire poem. And without reaching to the end of the poem, we fill the end, the objective, the aim of the poem also. Coming to the last part of this essay, chapter number 14 here, and in the last part, at the fag end of the essay, we come to know these concerns. So, our questions will be like this, which the answers of which you will find in subsequent discussion here. How does Coleridge differentiate between poem and poetry now? Yeah? So, as a philosopher, we will see the glimpse of the philosopher, critic, poet Coleridge. Yeah? Or poetry of the highest kind may exist without meter and even without the contradistinguishing objects of a poem also. So even if those legitimate parts of the poem which he discussed earlier, even if those are absent, then also poetry of the highest kind may exist. Yeah? Question 12 here is, a poem of any length neither can be nor ought to be all poetry. So, if you ask a question to a layman, what is the difference between a poem and a poetry? One would say that shorter is a poem, longer is poetry. So, well, the length cannot decide whether it is a poem or a poetry. The difference between poem and poetry is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. So that is where he is trying to conclude that what is the difference between them. The difference perhaps is not in the product, that is poem or a poetry, but perhaps it lies in the process of poetry. So perhaps it lies in the mind of the genius. Well, let us see how he discusses this part. the difference between poem and poetry, a very complex, a very difficult part of this essay. In the last section of the chapter 14, Coleridge considers to distinguish poem from poetry. Coleridge points out that poetry of the highest kind may exist without meter and even without the contradistinguishing objects of a poem. He gives example of the writings of Plato, Jeremy Taylor, and Bible. The quality of the prose in these writings is equal to that of high poetry. So he says that this prose of Jeremy Taylor or the Bible or Plato also has highly poetic quality. He also asserts that the poem of any length neither can be nor ought to be all poetry. Then the question is, what is poetry? How is it different from poem? To quote Coleridge, and I quote, "What is poetry? Is so nearly the same question with what is a poem. The answer to the one is involved in the solution of the other. For it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. Thus, the difference between poem and poetry is not given in clear terms. Even John Shawcross, in Biographia Literaria with aesthetical essays, who wrote that in 1907, writes, and I quote, "This distinction between poetry and poem is not clear, and instead of defining poetry, he proceeds to describe a poet, and from the poet he proceeds to enumerate the characteristics of the imagination." So this last part where he becomes a little bit philosophical in giving the difference is not in a clear-cut defining term writing this. And so we have to take help of some critics and their observations to enumerate the distinction that Coleridge perhaps had in the mind. So when we read John Shawcross and his explanation published in 1907, he also says or agrees with this idea that, well, Coleridge is not giving a clear-cut difference in the final part. This is so because poetry for Coleridge is an activity of the poet's mind. Poetry is not the finished product that we get something to read or listen, but that is the process. Poetry is the process, and it is the activity of the poet's mind, and a poem is merely one of the forms of its expression, a verbal expression of that activity, and the poetic activity is basically an activity of the imagination. So how this secondary imagination, we'll have to connect this part with chapter number 4, where he talks about the difference between fancy, primary imagination and secondary imagination. He also used the word asemplastic imagination. So when a poet will observe something and the emotions and feelings will get stirred, and when these emotions and feelings, they will not only have the flight of a fancy, but will have something like an asemplastic imagination which will connect that observed object or that experience with something so different, and yet it conveys the emotions and feelings to the reader without knowing that metaphor or that image in very clear terms. And if successfully that is done, then what is created is poetry. I don't know if I can again repeat the same thing that I have said right now, but it is so complex that it just happens somewhere deep in the mind of the poet. It perhaps can never get articulated in the physical form. Let us take help of David Deutsch, who in A Critical History of English Literature also said something about this. He points out poetry for Coleridge is a wider category than a poem. That is, poetry is a kind of activity which can be engaged in by painters or philosophers or scientists, and is not confined to those who employ metrical language or even to those who employ language of any kind. Well, David Deutsch perhaps is striking something very interesting here. And so he perhaps says that Coleridge wanted to say that poetry is not something that is written by only words. It can go beyond words also. So any painter or sculptors or philosopher's thinking or a wonderful discourse by a religious guru or a scientist, Pythagoras' theorem perhaps, or let us say when a technological genius creates a code and creates an app or a software which is so magnificent. For example, Steve Jobs creating a smartphone, touchscreen phone, or amalgamation of so many things in one device, Apple device or any kind of smartphone, if we consider the Android phone also, is nothing less than a poetry. So from Pythagoras' mathematical theorem to the technology that is developed by the software genius, or the way the artificial intelligence perhaps is working to create something that is beyond our imagination also, but so real in our world that we would be using those things very effectively. The creation of scientists, the thinking of philosophers, wonderful speeches of religious gurus, wherein or painters' work, wherein the language is utilized or not, perhaps all those things is poetry for Coleridge. Maybe David Deutsch wanted to say this. Poetry in this larger sense brings the whole soul of man into activity, with each faculty playing its proper part according to its relative worth and dignity. This takes place whenever the synthesizing, the integratizing powers of the secondary imagination are at work, bringing all aspects of a subject into a complex unity, then poetry in this larger sense results. So this is where the whole soul of man comes to an activity. It can be by anything, and when that happens, what that thing is perhaps poetry, wherein this secondary imagination, the assemblastic power of that imagination plays a very significant role. David Deutsch further writes in A Critical History of English Literature, the employment of the secondary imagination is a poetic activity. And we can see why Coleridge is led from a discussion of a poem to a discussion of a poet's activity when we realize that for him, the poet belongs to the larger company of those who are distinguished by the activity of their imagination. So anybody who has this capacity to work on their imagination, we know that even the scientists would say that imagination is ultimately important thing. Even in mathematical theorems, we find that if A is equal to so and so, so it is with imagination, if it is so. So it all begins with imagination. And all the great minds are highly imaginative. Poetry is the end result of that high imagination. By virtue of this his imagination, which is a synthetic and magical power, he harmonizes and blends together various elements and thus diffuses a tone and spirit of unity over the whole. David Deutsch helps us in understanding perhaps what was left untold by Coleridge in chapter number 14, that what really he means by the difference between poem and poetry. This imagination, as David Deutsch helps us to understand as an activity of poet's mind, this imagination manifests itself most clearly in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, such as A, of sameness with difference. See, the opposite, discording qualities of things, and some sort of balance or reconciliation is short with the help of secondary imagination. Of what? Of sameness with difference, of general with the concrete, of the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order, judgment with enthusiasm. So if a poet becomes highly enthusiastic, then also the poetry may drag into some fanciful things. So one requires a sensible judgment to work on the enthusiasm or the euphoria of writing a poem. Wordsworth rightfully used the word spontaneity with tranquility, with everybody's language, with selection of that, with a common man, yet with high sensibility. So even Wordsworth was striking at this balance or reconciliation of opposites, which here again Coleridge also is striking between the general and the concrete, the idea and the image, the individual and the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with the old and the familiar object, more than usual state of emotion with the order, and judgment with enthusiasm. And while this imagination blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, it subordinates to nature the manner to the matter, and our admiration of a poet to our sympathy with the poetry. And in this last part, that we subordinate to the manner to the matter, and our admiration is subordinated to the poetry, not to the poet. And we suddenly recall what, after so many years, T.S. Eliot is going to say something similar in tradition and individual talent. I quote T.S. Eliot, honest appreciation and sensitive criticism should be directed not upon the poetry but upon the poet. Maybe the new critics of 20th century also have derived some ideas from what Coleridge wanted to say here. To conclude, we may say, in his own words, he endeavored to establish the principle of writing rather than to furnish rules about how to pass judgment on what had been written by others. We have seen critics of this kind also who pass judgment on how to judge work of art. Coleridge, as a critic, was of a different school who passed principles of writing rather than passing judgment on what is written. And maybe this is something quite similar to everybody who is a poet critic. The poet critics and the critics who are not poets, like Aristotle is not a creative writer, he is the one who passes judgment on how to judge the work of art, how to judge the tragedy specifically and literature in general. So when a poet is a critic, they normally speak about the process or the activity of the mind. That's why Wordsworth also speaks about that. T.S. Eliot also speaks about that when he speaks about depersonalization, and he gives that chemical reaction of H2SO4, sulfuric acid, wherein this catalyst agent, the catalyst agent remains aloof and it is not found in H2SO4. So he also speaks about the activity of the mind of the poet. Coleridge also is similarly speaking about that. Thus Coleridge is the first English critic who based his literary criticism on philosophical principles, while critics before him had been content to turn a poem inside out and to discourse on its merits and demerits. Coleridge busied himself with the basic question of how it came to be there at all. How it came to be there at all. The poetic activity of the mind which creates that poetry. He was more interested in the creative process that made it what it was than in the finished product. So that perhaps makes the difference, what is poetry and what is the poem there. So this chapter number 14 deals in a very interesting way. To conclude, to wind up the things, we would say that he speaks initially about two cardinal points of poetry, which was utilized in lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge. He gives a very interesting defense of Wordsworth against the contemporary criticism, but he did not agree with Wordsworth's poetic creed, and he also said how he differentiated or did not agree with Wordsworth's poetic creed. And then he moved on to give a difference between prose and a poem, and also said about that there are two types of prose: the prose which are scientific, whose ultimate goal is to convey the truth or the fact, and then there are prose whose ultimate goal is to convey the truth, that is romances and prose. Poetry is near to this second type of prose, but then also they differentiate with each other, because poem is a composition. The legitimate poem is something where the entire composite whole of the poem has to convey something. Yeah? And then he moves to a much difficult part of the chapter, and that is where he differentiates between poem and poetry. And so we have to take help of David Deutsch to help us understand what he really meant by poetry. And we say that poetry is not something that is written, that is out, that is product. Poetry is perhaps a process. Poetry is something that happens in the mind of the genius. That genius may not deal with language at all. He may be a painter or a software engineer or a mathematician or a rhetorician or a logician or a religious guru who would be giving sermons about it also. So anybody who might utilize language or not utilize language, they also might be creating the poetry. And so it is the activity of the mind. I hope this will help you in your paper on literary theory and criticism. This is Samuel Taylor Coleridge as a critic. Thank you, everybody.